communicate with us that we need to eat. It's time. Because if we don't eat, if we go long enough without eating, we would eventually die. The science behind it is very interesting. Your stomach, when it's empty, it releases a hormone in your body known as ghrelin. And it's so amazing how Jehovah designed us, because this hormone communicates with our brains. And then our brains, of course, will do everything they can to satisfy that need. So wouldn't you say that it's easy to be conscious of your hunger? It's easy to be conscious of the need to eat. We were born hungry, and we will continue to get hungry every day for the rest of our lives. This is a need that everyone here has in common, everyone around the world has in common. And no one can argue with that. We all need to eat. But there's another need that everyone has in common. This is a physical need, but the other one we're going to talk about is a spiritual one. Notice what Jesus says at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3. A little bit of context before we read this. This is Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. Public talk, like we get every weekend meeting. And this is the most famous public talk ever given. So chapters 5, 6, and 7 are all the recordings of this talk. And it's full of valuable wisdom and insight. But out of all the ways Jesus could have started this talk, notice what he simply says. He's getting ready. This is his introduction. In verse 3, happy are those conscious of their spiritual need. A spiritual need. Jesus here was saying that all of us, doesn't matter who you are, has an innate spiritual need. Now the difference is, people satisfy this need in hundreds, not thousands of different ways. See, we all have the need to eat, but not all of us eat the same exact thing over and over again. Wouldn't that get a little boring? Well, when it comes to satisfying our spiritual need, there is one proper way to satisfy it. But notice some of the ways that people satisfy their spiritual need. They'll go to church once a week, maybe once a month. They'll do so through meditation, clearing one's mind of all thoughts, trying to find deeper meaning in life. Others try to connect with not a creator, rather they try to connect with the universe. They feel like spirituality isn't with God, but with creation, with Mother Nature. Others want to take the spiritual aspect of it all together. They want to take that out, and they know that there's a deeper meaning to life, and they try to find that through happy family life, a satisfying career, material possessions, traveling the world. But the common ground that we find with everyone is there is a need. But in order to satisfy it properly, we need to acknowledge that it's a spiritual need. And once we do that, we're one step closer to being able to satisfy it. Jehovah wants people to find spiritual truth. That's evident. Notice what Jesus says about this in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6 this time. Again, he says, happy are those hungering and thirsting for righteousness, since they will be filled. Righteousness. See, people hunger and thirst to try to satisfy their need, but they're not doing it in the proper way. Here Jesus says to hunger and thirst for what? Not material possessions, not the universe, but for righteousness. What does that mean, to thirst for righteousness? It means, simply put, to apply your standards of living to Jehovah's perfect standards of right and wrong. So how can we know the best way to satisfy our spiritual need? How do we know Jehovah's standards? Well, let's go back to our opening illustration talking about hunger. When you're trying to satisfy your hunger, what's the best way you can do that so that your body will benefit? Think about it for a second. Where could you turn to? Well, maybe a nutritional expert, maybe a nutritional book or guide. These are designed to tell you what to put into your bodies so that you can truly live a healthy life. Because not all food is going to be beneficial for you. The same is true when satisfying our spiritual need. We need to turn to the experts. We need to turn to Jehovah. And notice what Jehovah's provided for us, our spiritual nutritional guide. It's found at 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16. And here, Jehovah provided a book, and this book, he had written in it its credentials. There in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, he says, all scripture, or the Bible, is inspired of God and beneficial for teaching, for reproving, for setting things straight, for disciplining, there's that word again, in righteousness, Jehovah's standards of right and wrong. So, we need to be conscious of our spiritual need. We need to realize that that spiritual need needs to be in harmony with Jehovah's standards of right and wrong, and we find those standards in his word, the Bible. But to satisfy this need, we need to be diligent students of the Bible and then apply its message in our life. Why is applying its message in our life so important? Well, again, let's go back to our nutritional guide. Most nutritional guides, there's many of them, but most will encourage us to eat multiple servings of fruit and vegetables every day. These are good. These are benefit us. And that's a universal truth. You can't argue with that. But if you were to buy a nutritional guide or do all this research, you read that, and then you're like, okay, that's interesting, but you don't eat your fruits and your vegetables. Will it do any good for you? Well, of course not. We could read the Bible, but if we don't actually do what it says, it's not going to do any good for us. Notice how James illustrates this for us in the timeless illustration found in his inspired book of the Bible, James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. James chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 22. He says there, become doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself with false reasoning. So what does that mean to be a doer of the word? Well, he illustrates it this way. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, this is like a man looking at his own face in a mirror. So he uses this mirror to illustrate it. Let's take a look at a mirror that James could have had in mind when he was writing this inspired text. These are the first century Christian, this could be an example of a first century Christian mirror that they had commonplace in their homes. So when James says mirror, this is most likely what comes to their mind. Now, of course, these are old. They're ancient. However, brand new, polished up, you could see a reflection back at you. Of course, this illustration is so timeless because it has aged better with time. Because now all of us in our homes have mirrors, sometimes full-length mirrors. What do you see in every restroom when you're washing your hands? A mirror. Mirrors are part of our everyday life. So when we read this, we can relate even more. So he likens it to being a mirror, but notice verse 24. Thank you for the picture. He says, for he looks at himself. So he looks at himself in this mirror, and he goes away and immediately forgets what sort of person he is. Can you imagine that? Let's think about this for a moment. How many of us here looked in the mirror before coming to meeting today? I know I did. Did you look in a mirror before coming to meeting? Why? Well, for me, when I got out of bed this morning, my hair was a mess. Still kind of is, maybe. Maybe you look in the mirror and you want to make sure there's nothing in your teeth. That for our brothers, our ties are straight. We look in the mirror when we have to shave, if we did shave. Our sisters look in the mirror when they're applying their makeup. See, mirrors are part of everyday life. We can relate to them. But what if we went to the mirror, we saw that our hair was messy, there was stuff in our teeth, that our ties were crooked. Okay, looks good to me. Walk out the door, come to meeting. Would it be the mirror's fault? that we didn't do anything about our appearance. No, the mirror did its job. It was trying to show us. We just didn't make the corrections. So that's what James is saying here. He looks at himself. And so the Bible is like this mirror. We could read it. It will reflect our personalities back at us, how we are applying Jehovah's standards of right and wrong. But we have the option whether or not to do anything about it. Are we applying it? But notice the benefits of applying it. Verse 25, he says, but the one who peers into the perfect law that belongs to freedom and continues in it has become not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, and he will be happy in what he does. What comes to your mind when you think of peering into the Bible, peering into that mirror? Well, what I instantly thought of was sometimes that full body mirror isn't enough. Sometimes we really want to see the nooks and crannies of things that we want to fix. You get those magnifying mirrors, right? You look in there and then you're really able to make corrections. That's what James is telling us to do with the Bible. The Bible will magnify if we peer into it. It will magnify what we need to correct about ourselves. So again, to go in harmony with Jehovah's standards of right and wrong, we need to peer into it. Now, how often? Well, again, how often do we look in a mirror? How many of us, since walking to the Kingdom Hall, have looked into the mirror when we use the restroom? See, we don't look at a mirror at the beginning of the week and then be like, okay, I'll be back here this time next Sunday and look again, see how everything's going. No, mirrors are part of our everyday life. We're constantly making corrections because we care about how we appear, how we conduct ourselves. The Bible needs to be part of our daily routine. We don't look at it once a week, every couple of days, and then think, okay, I'll come back and see how I'm doing this time next week. No, we look at it every single day. We peer into it because this world is designed to make us dirty, so to speak. This can happen so quick, and so we need to look at those changes and correct them as soon as possible. What a wonderful illustration that James provided for us here. But as we can see, this takes work. Satisfying our spiritual need in harmony with Jehovah isn't the easiest way to satisfy our spiritual need. That's why a lot of times people turn to other ways to satisfy this innate spiritual need. However, is it what's the best for them? Again, going back to how we eat, our diets, what do we see pop up on relatively every single street corner when you're driving? Maybe when you drove here, what do we see? Fast food. We see it everywhere. Why? Why is it so popular? Well, it's because it's convenient, it's cheap, it's easy, and they've designed it to taste relatively good. But is it what's best for us? Of course not. Then why do we eat it? Because it's easy and convenient. The same is true with this world. Satan has designed it to make Jehovah's standards of healthy spiritual living seem too hard, too impossible to live up to. And so he gives us fast food, so to speak. This world is full of horrible, morally degrading things, but people, they succumb to them because it's easy, it's convenient, it's all around them. They don't have time to put spiritual things first. So what can help us to stick to our healthy spiritual diets? By looking at the things that can prevent us from sticking to them. Jesus outlined for us obstacles that we will face on a daily basis, obstacles that Satan will put in front of us time and again to distract us from satisfying our spiritual need. What are they? Well, it's found in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. And notice these obstacles in verses 37 and 38. Talking about the time period we're living in. He says, "For just as the days of Noah were, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. For as they were in those days before the flood, eating and drinking, men marrying, and women being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark." And let's take special care to focus on verse 39. And they took no note. They took no note. The things that they were caught up in, the distractions, weren't necessarily bad things, but they were distracting them from the more important things so that they took no note. Do you see that as a possibility in your life? Are we so distracted by things of this world, we're bombarded with them, that we're just simply not taking note of spiritual things that Jehovah provides for us? This is a warning. Jesus wrote this. We don't want to feel bad if this is happening to us. Jesus knew it would happen. We just need to take special care to make sure that this isn't happening in our lives. It's just everyday distractions, and we simply run out of time. But what can help us to put spiritual things on a pedestal, so to speak, to make spiritual things our top priority? By looking at Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy is such a wonderful thing that we will begin to understand if we take the time to peer into the Bible. When we study Bible prophecy, we get a clear picture of the time period we're living in. When we study Bible prophecies such as 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, that clearly outline the attitudes and personality traits of people living in the last days in our time period, it becomes abundantly clear how close we are to the end of this wicked world. And that causes us to want to take note, to act, and satisfy our spiritual need. But we can read prophecies, and we can read about the paradise earth and the resurrection, seeing our dead loved ones again, and these are wonderful things. In fact, these are things that people learn at the very beginning, before when they first start studying the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses. And these really start our spirituality. It's like a fire that's ablaze in our hearts. But if we don't nurture that fire, it will never grow. We might illustrate it this way. You're starting a campfire. And what do you often use when starting a campfire? Well, you can use newspaper, small pieces of wood. I find what I like to use is pine needles, because pine needles will just burn large and bright, like we can see in our picture here. You just take a match to that little pile, or you can do a bigger pile, and it catches right away. You couldn't go to a big log and light it on fire. It wouldn't catch. But this stuff catches fire fast. That's like what reading about the paradise and the resurrection does in our hearts. Those things motivate us. They stir us. And sometimes we might think that that's enough. Just like this fire. If we really just started adding more and more pine needles, it would burn, but would it last? Well, any experienced fire maker or camper will tell you no, it will not. What do you need to do? Well, you need to put in some work. And as we see in our next picture, we put in some work, we grab out our axe, and we start chopping firewood. We start with that little bit of kindling, we put that on top of our fire. We might liken the kindling and with our spirituality to not just learning about the resurrection, but cultivating love for Jehovah and Jesus, the one that provide this resurrection hope for us. This will burn stronger for us. This kindling could be appreciation for Jesus' ransom sacrifice, which makes the resurrection hope possible for us in the first place. These are things that will burn for longer periods of time, but it takes work. We have to take out our axe, so to speak, and we need to peer into the Bible. We need to cultivate these things. And something that will burn for a long time is if we cultivate strong faith in these promises that Jehovah has given us. Strong faith, that will burn bright. But how do we cultivate faith? And why is faith so important? Well, Jesus knew when he was teaching his disciples these things that they would face extreme persecution and severe obstacles. So he wanted to make sure that their faith was strong. And so he told them an illustration about why faith is important and what the consequences can be if we do not cultivate strong faith. And this illustration will apply for us today. So let's take a look at it. It's found at Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. A little bit of setting in this chapter. Jesus had just left his house. He was sitting by the seed, and as always, large crowds were following around Jesus and swarming him, so much so that on this particular occasion, he had to board a boat. And so now he's off the beach, and he's just a few feet, a couple yards in on the water. And he starts teaching them from there. So let's pick up in reading in verse 3. It says, "Then he told them many things by illustration, saying, 'Look, a sower went out to sow. As he was sowing, some seeds fell alongside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell on rocky ground, where there was not much soil, and they immediately sprang up because the soil was not deep. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came and choked them. Still others fell on fine soil, and they began to yield fruit. This one 100 times more, that one 60, the other 30. Then he ends it, 'Let the one who has ears listen.'" Now, the answer to this illustration isn't found in verse 10, 11, 12, 13. No, Jesus leaves them kind of hanging at this point. It's like a cliffhanger, right? What does this illustration mean? And he doesn't answer it until verse 18. Now, we don't know how long a time this actually translates to in real life, but his disciples were no doubt in eager anticipation of what does this illustration have to do with me? And what we want to know, what does this illustration have to do with faith? So let's see how Jesus explains this. First off, a couple of things we need to identify. What are the seeds? Well, simply put, the seed is Jehovah's inspired word, the Bible. And the soil is a person's heart condition. So what do these different kinds of grounds represent? Well, verse 18 or verse 19 says, "Where anyone hears the word of the kingdom, but does not get a sense of it, the wicked one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one sown alongside the road." What about the rocky ground? Well, verses 20 and 21 show that this rocky ground is someone hearing the word and accepting it with joy, yet he has no root. And when persecution and tribulation come, he is at once stumbled. And then what about the thorns? The thorns are one for me personally that I can relate to. What about for you? Verse 22, "As for the one sown among the thorns, this is the one hearing the word, but the anxiety of this system of things and the deceptive power of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." This represents someone that lets the distractions that we talked about overtake their once fertile soil, where that seed landed, but it begins to choke it out until there's just no room for spiritual things to grow. So these are the cautions. And as we can see in our picture here, illustrated so beautifully for us, there at the top you see the seeds that fell along and the birds came and ate them away. Again, that represents people that didn't make time for spiritual things. And you can see some of the crowds following that course. Then on the right, you see the one that did sprout up right away, but it was scorched. And again, this is representing those who showed initial production, but they didn't have strong root. And some of the crowds went off that direction too. We see this happening today. And then the other one there, the thorns, it choked out the word, the anxieties, the distractions, and some went that direction. But notice Jesus and that wonderful harvest there in that picture right underneath Jesus and his disciples following him. What does this represent? This is what we want to be. Let's take a look at verse 23. "As for the one sown upon the fine soil, this is the one hearing the word, getting the sense of it, and really does bear fruit and produces. This one 100 times more, that one 60, the other 30. What does this mean? Well, that fine soil will endure anything around it. It won't be choked by anxiety. It won't be distracted by the material possessions of this world or the other things that people are trying to pursue. No, it will bear fruit. What does this fruit represent? Well, this is representing the blessings that Jehovah will shower upon all of us if we take the time to make sure that our soil, our heart condition, is allowing our spirituality to grow. It's so important. It's true that a person's spirituality is an individual responsibility. But there is a special responsibility that Jehovah places on all family heads. So we'll take a moment to talk to spiritual family heads. This represents a couple people. This could be a man over his wife, or if he has children, or for our single parents out there, our single mothers who are raising children. You are the spiritual head. Now, there is a special responsibility placed on your shoulders. How so? Well, you need to care for the spiritual need of your family. And this can be a challenge sometimes because of the world that we live in. Let's go back to our food illustration. Imagine a physical head that's providing for his family. He goes to the grocery store, let's say Whole Foods. He goes into Whole Foods and he grabs the finest produce, the best of the best vegetables, fruit. He gets a healthy protein, a carbohydrate, and he goes home and he cooks just a delicious meal. Not only that, it's healthy, and it's got all the nutrition that he will need to live a healthy diet. He plates it up, sets it in front of him. His family's sitting around the table with him, and he's like, oh, I almost forgot. And he pulls up a big bag and sets Taco Bell right in front of him. Here's your bean and cheese burritos. Would that make any sense? Would that be a loving family head? Would he be showing that he cares about the physical nutrition of his family? Of course not. It's ludicrous. That's why it's comical. But in a spiritual sense, we could be inadvertently doing this as spiritual heads to our families. How so? Well, we're taking the time to do our personal study and going to the meetings, preparing comments, going out in the ministry. But are we taking the time to help our children do this? Are we making sure that we're taking a regular interest in their needs? Are we conducting regular family worship evenings every single week? Are we helping our kids prepare comments? Are we asking our wives about what they're commenting? What are they doing for their own personal study? See, this is showing keen interest in the spirituality of our families, and it's so important. So as we continue to provide for ourselves, we need to provide for our families. But again, we emphasize this point, everyone has that individual responsibility. And as we can see, being conscious of our spiritual need isn't enough. We need to satisfy it in the proper way by applying Jehovah's high moral standards. We find those standards found in the Bible, but of course that's not the easiest way to live. So we identified obstacles that could possibly interfere with satisfying our spiritual need in the right way. We know what to avoid. And then finally, we want to talk about some blessings. We talked about in that scripture there that a successful heart, that soil that is fine, produces 100 times more. Think about the blessings you receive by continuing to satisfy your spiritual need in the proper way. We have meetings like this one, and we look forward to our meeting Monday. And then next Saturday, these spiritual meetings become part of our everyday routine. They counteract this wicked world. These meetings are a blessing in themselves. We have our worldwide brotherhood. We get to talk with friends at these meetings that are going through similar trials and struggles that we are. We get to ask them how are they continuing to satisfy their spiritual needs. There are so many blessings, and the effort that's required to follow Jehovah's high moral standards starts to feel easy when we focus on the blessings. And we haven't even started talking about the blessings that we will receive in the new world forever. Imagine this time period that we're living in, everyone is opposed and has their own different ideas on how to worship acceptably, and a lot of people don't even worship God. But imagine in the near future, that paradise earth where everyone living on earth will have the same moral values as you. They will have the same God as you. You can go up to anyone. It could be a total stranger that you've never met before, but you know them because you know they worship Jehovah and that they're satisfying their spiritual need the way we learned briefly today. So as we continue to experience the moral decay of this wicked world, may we always strive to battle that decay by satisfying our spiritual need, by reading God's word, the Bible, and by cultivating strong, unfailing love for our wonderful God.